Now here's more from today's featured artist on Frank's Magic Bus.
And our feature is our one-on-one conversation with Peter Asher. He was the Peter of Peter and Gordon back in the 1960s, and he became a legendary producer after that with Linda Ronstadt and James Taylor and others in the 1970s. He was good friends with the Beatle at the time. At the height of Beatlemania, Paul McCartney, his sister Jane, had been going with Paul for years. So there is a deep musical connection between Peter Asher and the Beatles. Apple Records has released a compilation disc of various artists, released, of course, by EMI, who a lot of Americans might not recognize at first, like Jackie Lomax. A lot of good Badfinger stuff on there. And Peter was head of A&R at Apple Records when he found his claim to fame as a producer. Of course, he had that in common with Paul McCartney.
I'm interested in production and brilliance and all those things, and that's why, that's how it all segued into when the Peter and Gordon era came to a close, ended up at Apple, and which is the other thing that's going on now, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah, Apple Records now, EMI putting out a big archive of Apple Records' various artists' releases from those days when you were heavily involved. You kind of took over kind of production right at Apple Records from early on?
Yes, I mean, I was turning from being an artist into a record producer because I loved the process of making records. I'd found it fascinating throughout the years Gordon and I had been recording. So I'd become a record producer, and Paul liked some of the things I'd done, and indeed had played on some of the things I'd done for me. And so he asked me first if, as they developed this idea, initially nameless, for a record company that was going to be very different in style and objectives from the major labels that were around then, which were very formal and corporate by nature. So he asked me if I would produce some records, and then as it became more real, and we developed the ideas in collective discussion into Apple, he asked me if I would be head of A&R for the label. So that's indeed what my role was for a couple of years there.
And I find it so intriguing that you guys at Apple kind of latched on and saw something in a pretty much unknown James Taylor, other than the coffee houses in New York City that he played.
Yes, I was lucky in that regard. James came to me actually nothing to do with Apple in the sense that the connection was a guitar player called Danny Korchmar, who had been in a band called the King Bees, which backed Peter and Gordon on a couple of their U.S. tours.
Yeah, Cooch, right? The old buddy Cooch.
Correct. Absolutely, Coocheroo. And he and I became great friends. I would stay with him when I was in L.A. and so on. And after the King Bees, he was in a band called the Flying Machine with James Taylor, who was actually a childhood friend of his. Mm-hmm. James and Cooch had been friends since they were 14 or something. So when the Flying Machine failed to make it in New York and broke up, James decided to head for London to kind of seek fame and fortune and just explore. And Danny gave him my phone number, simply as, here's my best friend in London, give him a call. So James called me up a few days after arriving and came over and played me this tape he'd made, and I was overwhelmed, super impressed, and told him, look, it so happens I've just got this new job. I'm head of A&R for Apple Records. We'll sign you. And he said, oh, okay, cool. So it all seemed incredibly easy. One forgets, of course, at the time there were probably thousands of Americans going, I'm going to go to London and meet the Beatles,
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
And in fact, he did so. And, within days of arriving, I had him in there with the board of directors, meeting everyone and signing a record contract.
No, I got to tell you, I'm going to be honest about this. I was in high school when that album came out. I might have been the only one in that high school in Michigan that bought that first album. Of course, by Sweet Baby James, he was becoming a big hit. But that first album, just called James Taylor, were you responsible for that fantastic, the string section bridges and segues between the songs there?
I was responsible for deciding they should be there, but I can't.
Thank you is what I want to say.
I didn't write them. A friend of mine who's a classical composer and a jazz trumpet player called Richard Hewson, who's brilliant. I didn't want them to be traditional pop arrangements, so I didn't use any of the arrangers like Jeff Love, brilliant though he was, who'd worked with Peter and Gordon. So I went outside that field to a classical friend of mine, and he wrote all those cool charts.
Well, I got to tell you, it just meant so much at the time because it was so different. It flew in the face of what was going on with rock and even country rock or acoustic rock because it was so symphonic. The great string sections and bridges. It kind of almost made the album in a way.
Well, thank you very much. In retrospect, I worry that that album was sort of overproduced in that sense, that I over-decorated it. But I was just such a gigantic fan of James and the songs, I wanted to make people pay attention. And in your case, it sounds like it worked, so thank you.
Oh, it absolutely did, and I didn't want to say that word, overproduced. I've heard other people criticize that, but never me. It's like, I'm sure you can get maybe a stripped-down version of that album some way, if it's a bootleg or if it's coming out. But
we haven't done that, but that's actually kind of an interesting idea. But I don't know if Apple or I have ever thought about that, or where the multi-track tapes are. Yeah, a stripped-down version might be interesting. You know, in a way, of course, I think I learned from that, and then when we did Sweet Baby James here in L.A. after we'd left Apple, and by that time I was James's manager, we did, make a considerably simpler, more basic sounding album.